Hello everybody and welcome to Every Movie Ever. I am of course Eric Houston and this is the show where we are reviewing every movie ever made. And we're going to start this week with 42. Now don't panic, this is not a movie based on the answer to the great question of life, the universe, and everything. Rather, this is a biopic about the great Jackie Robinson, the man who broke the color barrier in baseball. And of course it stars, this is probably the best part of the movie, it stars the great Chadwick Boseman, who's currently tearing it up as Black Panther in Marvel Studios' huge blockbuster, terrific movie. This is from a few years ago where he's, like I say, doing a biopic. It also stars Harrison Ford as the baseball manager whose idea this whole thing was. I like Harrison Ford in this a lot. It's sort of an atypical role for Ford. It's not very action-y or anything. It does tap really well into Ford's current curmudgeon-y old manness, which is nice, but it's a little bit of a change of pace from the sort of tough guy screen Ford we're used to seeing. As for the movie itself, it's a good movie. It's really watchable. It is unfortunately, however, not particularly deep. I didn't leave it feeling like I really got to know Jackie all that well or his world all that well, but it is a really good movie and worth a watch. I'm going to give it 3 stars. Let's talk about another true story. Let's talk about Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam. Yes, it is a movie that I, like all Americans, know mostly from clip shows about movies and seeing that immortal clip of watching Robin Williams scream at the camera. It's one I'd never actually seen, and I decided I would finally sit down and watch it. It's about a guy, a U.S. Army soldier in Vietnam who's sort of tasked with running the radio station. And yeah, obviously I don't think I'm shocking anybody saying it's a really solid, very good movie. Largely it ends up being a movie about fighting against censorship. Robin Williams' commanding officers don't really like the comedy show he's doing for the U.S. services in Vietnam. They want him to tone it down. They don't want him to talk ill of the Army or of Nixon or anything like that. Another big part of the movie is that one of Williams' friends is a member of, as a Vietnamese gentleman who turns out to be a member of the Viet Cong, and watching Williams struggle with that and feeling, not knowing what to do about if he should turn this guy in, and also feeling betrayed by the guy and those feelings. Like I said, this is a very good, very solid movie. Part of me, and maybe it's just because I like that kind of a thing, I guess I would have liked to have seen more about the radio station and more about Williams dealing with that, or conversely, more about his time and the culture of Vietnam in that period. What was it like to be there are a ton of movies about men on the front lines of Vietnam. It is interesting to see more of what it was like sort of at the home office in Vietnam. And the movie never really focuses on either one of those, but tries to split the difference between the two of them in a way that I never find fully satisfying, but which, like I say, is still a very good movie that I'm going to give 3.5 stars. Let's continue my documentary kick by talking about The Problem With A Poo. This is a recent documentary that is all about Apu from The Simpsons, and it was written and directed and presented by an Indian American comedian who grew up having a real problem with Apu, in that Apu was the only Indian face he would see on television. And this is a movie about how that feels, and about how it feels when the only character that other people see that represents your culture is this sort of cartoonish caricature. It was an interesting movie, but a little bit slight. I wish it had gone a little bit more in depth. In part, that's not the movie's fault. I think the thing the movie is missing the most is an interview with Hank Azaria, the white man who does the voice of Apu. There are some archive interview stuff in here, but Azaria ultimately declined to be interviewed for the piece, although there are some people associated with The Simpsons who do talk on camera, and the conversation throughout is very interesting. It's a very interesting commentary about representation, which is a thing that we're hearing more about today in our entertainment, and we should be, about how it feels to be represented on TV. As a white man, it's something I'll never really understand fully, because everywhere I look, in every movie and every TV show, there's a white guy I can relate to. But when you're an Indian man, like this gentleman is, and there's only a poo, that is a conundrum. Now, I saw this on True TV, and I came to find out it was edited down for television. So the full feature version looks to be about 10 or 15 minutes longer, and that might have fleshed things out a little better. As is, this is still a very good and interesting movie that I think if you're interested in the current conversation about representation, or if you just, or if you're confused by it, I think this is a good movie to watch to understand it a little bit better. I'm going to give it 3.5 stars. All right, folks, let's step over to MST3K A to Z. So this is, of course, the portion of the show where we're talking about a couple of movies that were featured on Mystery Science Theater 3000. I am, of course, a big fan, and I am going back through the Mystery Science Theater archives, watching every episode in alphabetical order because I am a huge nerd. Today I want to talk to you about two of them, and we're going to start with The Beast of Hollow Mountain. This is a 1950s, sort of a rare thing for its time, and that's a genre mashup. It's sort of a Western sci-fi thing. I wish that the genres were a little bit more mixed. And that this movie was a little bit more sci-fi throughout. The thing of it is, though, is largely this is a movie that for the first hour and 10 minutes is largely about ranch hands with missing cattle. And then just during the last 15 or 20 minutes, there's a dinosaur. This is it's interesting in that this is kind of a claymation dinosaur, which as opposed to like a puppet or really more of a, well, I guess it is stop motion, but it's a little more unreal looking than you might expect out of something from more of like the Harryhausen school. I do like that about it, though. It gives the dinosaur in the movie itself sort of a different look. As for the movie overall, it's fine. It could be worse. It's a little boring in parts. I think this would be a little more effective if it were closer to the hour mark, or like I say, if they had, sort of seeded the dinosaur into the proceedings a little bit earlier. As it stands, it's reasonably watchable. I'd say it's about 2 stars. Sticking with the Mystery Science Theater movies, let's talk about The Beast of Yucca Flats. Now, this is a pretty famous movie among both Mystery Science Theater fans and connoisseurs of bad movies, especially old-time bad movies. Produced and directed by Coleman Francis, a sort of a schlock movie auteur almost, who is even worse than Ed Wood. The level of incompetence on display in a Coleman Francis movie is almost aggressive, and whereas Wood would make up for the, his technical shortcomings in movies with sheer enthusiasm and verve and mad ideas, Coleman Francis really, I don't know a lot about him behind the scenes. I should really look into it. But the feeling I get from him is a little more opportunistic and a little bit more profit motivated, and so his movies outside of just being bad also seem to lack a soul. This particular movie, Beast of Yucca Flats, is, the only word I can use to describe it is that it's just inscrutable. There is no point in watching this movie that you know at all what's going on. It's made up of a bunch of disjointed scenes that may as well be from completely different movies, sort of pasted together. The narrative, such as it is, follows Tor Johnson, the Swedish wrestler and fixture of some Ed Wood movies, as a scientist who, in Incredible Hulk fashion, gets exposed to a nuclear weapon and then sort of wanders around the desert. A lot of the movie is told through narration to try and help these, like I say, disparate, disjointed images stick more closely together. But overall, it's a hard one to understand and a really hard one to follow. This really is, I think the phrase gets bandied about a lot. It's not one I like to use, but this truly is one of the worst movies of all time. I'm giving it the lowest rating I can give it, which is half a star. All right, folks, let's head over to the Christmas corner. This is, of course, where we discuss Christmas and seasonal and holiday movies, particularly the Christmas movies that proliferate the Hallmark Channel around that time of the year. And right now I want to talk to you about Miss Christmas. Miss Christmas is a movie about a lady who we are to understand in her, I believe, unnamed, well, I think it's New York, or I don't know, maybe Cincinnati. But in her big city, she is synonymous with Christmas. So this is a lady who puts on the big Christmas pageant in the city every year, and one of her biggest responsibilities is to track down what's essentially a knockoff of the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree, a big freaking Christmas tree. And this is a movie about her trying to find that year's big Christmas tree, only to find herself blocked by the owner of the tree, Mark Blucas, who you might remember from Buffy the Vampire Slayer's 4th season as the army boyfriend for Buffy, the complete misfire army boyfriend. Here, he is a rancher, a tree rancher, who has lost his wife, and for some reason that makes him not want to sell his big Christmas tree, even though his little boy really wants him to sell the big Christmas tree to Miss Christmas. Of course, Miss Christmas falls in love with Mark Blucas, and there's a lot of confusion, and they don't understand what each other's doing, and that leads to complications and whatever. So listen, it's a really standard, romantic comedy, plot of miscommunication. This one, sometimes these Hallmark Christmas movies make that work. This one does not sell it at all. There's also just not enough here. There's not enough plot to it, so there's a lot of wheel spinning, a lot of navel gazing. This is not a particularly fun one, and it's unaided by a completely uncharismatic Miss Christmas, and Mark Blucas, who, wasn't any good in Buffy, doesn't fare any better here in a movie that, let's face it, was no Buffy. Miss Christmas, wait for it, is a miss. I'm going to give it 1 star. All right, folks, it is time for us to talk horror movies. That's right, it is Calling All Horror Hounds. This week we're going to talk about the 2011 version of The Thing. Now, longtime viewers of the program, friends, family, they all know that I'm a big fan of John Carpenter's immortal The Thing. One of the truly great horror movies ever made, one of the great remakes. And I'll also throw the original 50s Howard Hawks' The Thing from Another World in there as a very different but also very great movie. So when they announced they were going to remake The Thing yet again, and remake it in a way that was more in line with Carpenter's movie than with like the original book or the original film, it seemed that was a real head scratcher for me. Carpenter had done such a tremendous job. Why did anyone think that they would be able to follow it? And why did they think they were going to follow it with CGI effects when a big part of what makes Carpenter's Thing work so well is those tremendous practical makeup effects from the great Rob Bottin? Well, I finally saw The Thing, which sets itself up actually not as a sequel to Carpenter's Thing, but as a prequel, focusing on the Norwegian team that we see at the very beginning of Carpenter's Thing. Now, this obviously isn't a review of Carpenter's Thing, and I don't mean to keep harping on it, but a thing that I like so much about Carpenter's Thing is how he uses that Norwegian team. How the movie starts with a dog showing up, having, escaped from a Norwegian base further out on Antarctica, and the scientists in the American base have to go investigate it. And Carpenter sets that Norwegian base up as having essentially had the events from the original Howard Hawks Thing having happened to them. So we see some of the iconic moments from Howard Hawks' picture through surveillance footage of the Norwegian camp, such as the scientists spreading out into a big circle and creating a ring over the ice-buried alien spaceship. Now, I've been talking about this for a couple minutes, but I guess I've neglected to tell those of you who might not have ever seen another version of The Thing what these movies are about. And to you I say, what are you doing with your lives, guys? Go out and see The Thing, for heaven's sake. But these movies are about science teams in Antarctica who stumble upon an alien menace, and the alien can take the form of any other living thing. So it can look just like one of the other scientists, or a dog, or something else. And so the scientists are never sure which of them is a real person and which of them is the thing. So what about this 2011 version of the thing? I'd been avoiding seeing it for a number of years because, again, how are you going to top Carpenter? And I finally watched it, and I got to tell you, you know what? It's not that bad. It's not great, but it's not that bad. It's certainly watchable. The CGI effects are decent. They're not a blush on Bottin, but in this age with, where crummy CGI effects abound, these aren't bad. These are all right. And I do miss the great practical effects, obviously, but the CGI ones are not bad. The star of this one is Mary Elizabeth Winstead, who played Ramona in the Scott Pilgrim movie and was in 10 Cloverfield Lane. She's pretty good, and there are a couple of good, gross, scary moments, particularly a part where a guy's head kind of splits open to become chompers, which is evocative of what Bottin was doing, and I don't want to keep trashing it. Let's just say it's a pretty good moment. So The Thing, 2011, it's certainly unessential, but it isn't bad. I'm going to give it 2.5 stars. All right, let's head over to the Columbo Files. This week on the Columbo Files, so this is a brand new segment, guys. So I have been watching a lot of Columbo lately because I really like Columbo. And I was struggling for a minute about whether or not these are something I should be reviewing on the show here. After all, I'm sure a lot of you are saying, it's a TV show. Well, Columbo is somewhat unique in the world of TV shows in that it's actually a series of TV movies that were originally part of the rotating mystery movie format. So each episode of Columbo is a movie, and if I'm reviewing every movie ever, eventually I'm going to have to review every Columbo, and that's what the Columbo Files are all about. We're going to start with Double Exposure. This is a 70s episode of Columbo. You're going to find as we do these that there's sort of two sets of Columbos. There's the 70s Columbos and the 90s Columbos when they brought him back. This is the 70s. The villain in this is Robert Culp. If you are already familiar with Columbo, then you know that typically the way this works is they get a television star to be the murderer. In this case, it's Robert Culp from I Spy. Culp plays a guy who makes industrial movies, and what we mean by that are those sort of like, the sort of movies that are either like kind of how-to things or are usually made for a private company to show off like their cars or factories or to instruct their employees or whatever. Culp has ideas about subliminal messagery, and he uses his subliminal messagery to kill a dude. Now, I'm sure some of you are howling spoiler. Well, you guys, you don't know how Columbo works. Part of the innovation of Columbo is that you see the murder in the first 15 minutes. These are not whodunits. The beginning of every Columbo movie is watching the murder happen. And then the fun of it is watching Columbo figure it out, piece together the clues and figure out what's going on. Columbo, of course, likes to pretend to be kind of a bumbling detective to put people at ease, all the while he's shrewdly figuring things out and manipulating people into telling them things they might not otherwise. I liked this one a lot. I don't really have a ton to say about it. Culp is not a favorite star of mine necessarily, but he's good here. It was fun for me, obviously, to see some of the behind-the-scenes, film work of that time, working on the old editing beds and working with the projectors and stuff. And the clues as they're strung through are pretty good. Culp is pretty good. Peter Falk is, as always, tremendous as Columbo. This is a real solid one that, while not being particularly unique or, something towering in its own right, is a really solid Columbo. I'm going to give it 3.5 stars. All right, guys, it's time for probably nobody's favorite part of the show. This is the worst of the week. This week's worst of the week is comic. Ooh, it's hard to say. That's part of what makes it the worst of the week. Is it's Chronic Con, episode 420, A New Dope. Saying that out loud to you guys, I am very embarrassed that I watched this movie. So here's the deal. This is a movie from Doug Benson, and if you don't know Doug Benson, I'm not necessarily surprised. If you, like me, are a big podcast listener and alternative comedy fan, you know who Doug Benson is. He's a comedian, and he hosts a couple of podcasts, the most famous being Doug Loves Movies. I'm sure you're shocked to hear that I sometimes listen to a podcast called Doug Loves Movies, which is sort of a talk show, game show thing where Doug has a number of guests on and they talk about movies. Now, what you wouldn't know about Doug from this is that Doug really likes marijuana. Now, that said, I am not necessarily endorsing that by any stretch of the imagination, but it's important to know for this, if only to explain the really stupid title. Here's the thing. I'm not a big fan of pot humor. I never have been. But I like Doug's other humor, so I thought this documentary where he goes to Comic-Con would be something interesting. This is part of a series of documentaries he's doing that essentially apes documentaries already made by Morgan Spurlock. So Spurlock did that Super Size Me about how McDonald's is bad for you. Well, Doug Benson did Super High Me, right? Morgan Spurlock did a Comic-Con documentary. This is Benson's Comic-Con documentary. Here's the thing, it's not good, guys. Probably the best part of it is that a large portion of this documentary portrays one of his podcast tapings, a taping of Doug Loves Movies, but this time on film. So that was fun. I liked seeing that. It featured some comedians I liked, like Scott Aukerman. But the rest of it, where he sort of walks around Comic-Con and interviews people, isn't terribly interesting. What makes this truly the worst of the week, outside of, like I say, that really embarrassing name, has got to be the interminable end. You know, the movie is watchable enough for most of its running time, but then the last 20 minutes are a marijuana-fueled rambling around town that makes absolutely no sense and just goes on forever and ever and drags seemingly without end. It's truly interminable. As for the movie itself, like I say, I got some joy from watching the part of Doug's act that I do like, that podcast taping, but I found the rest of it a very frustrating movie. That's why it's this week's worst of the week, and that's why it's getting 2 stars. And of course, we always end our show with the best of the bunch. This week we are looking at Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond, featuring a very special contractually obligated mention of Tony Clifton. Yes, that's the full title of this movie, guys, because we may as well follow up one bizarrely titled documentary with another. So this documentary, which obviously it's the best of the bunch, means I loved it. This is all about the behind the scenes of Man on the Moon, the 90s Milos Forman directed Andy Kaufman biopic that starred Jim Carrey. And here's the thing, Jim it's not even kind of, he literally decided throughout the course of the production of this movie that he had been possessed by the spirit of Kaufman and decided that gave him carte blanche to be hugely obnoxious on the set. During the filming, a documentary crew followed Jim around, and the movie studio that released Man on the Moon looked at that footage and said, "You can't release this. If people see this footage, they're going to know that Jim Carrey was a jerk, and that could affect our bottom line." Well, now it's years later. They decided they don't care anymore. Jim Carrey, who knows what's going on with that guy? I guess he decided, not only did he not care, he sat down for an extensive one-on-one interview about all of it, which makes up the backbone of this feature. The whole thing was directed by Chris Smith, who had made one of the great documentaries of the last 25 years with American Movie about a couple of Midwestern guys trying to make a horror movie. And this strikes some similar notes. I mean, obviously, this is a behind the scenes of a much more professional and high-budgeted and famous affair, but the sort of madness of the movies is on full display here. It is a really unflinching portrait. If you are at all a fan of behind-the-scenes movie stuff, if you are at all a fan of, movie horror stories, this is one for you. It truly is one. Watching Carrey devolve and watching the hugely frustrated and done reactions of the other people on the set, from Foreman all the way down to the co-stars, this is a true marvel of insanity. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm giving it 4 big stars. All right, well, that is it for this episode of Every Movie Ever. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next time with more movies and movie reviews on Every Movie Ever.